This chapter explains how open source licenses are defined and how they work. It builds on the general topic of intellectual property by delving into the specific area of open source licensing and by comparison to non-open source licenses. It's important to comply with all third-party licenses, including open source, to avoid copyright infringement and to ensure an organization can continue using the software. Please note that this chapter does not require a legal background. While I do discuss some concepts from law, I will do this in a non-technical way that does not require any previous legal knowledge. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand the basic rights and obligations provided by open source licenses. Open source licenses vary in their specific terms, but they all allow users to use, study, share, and improve the software they receive. By necessity, this means that the source code for the software is made available. These licenses often also have conditions related to providing a copy of the license, a copyright statement, and sometimes a written offer to make source code available to users. To ensure clarity around open source software licenses, there are various definitions to contextualize the field. A frequently used definition is by the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, and is called the Open Source Definition, the OSD. This lists their criteria that determines whether a license qualifies as an open source license or not. There can be licenses that are very similar to open source licenses, but do not meet all of these criteria. And it's worth remembering that open source, by most definitions, cannot limit the field of use of the software. Licenses such as Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial are inherently non-commercial and therefore not open source due to the restricted field of use. On occasion, you may even come across some typical open source license text with an additional clause such as only for non-commercial stuck on at the end, which as a result makes it overall a non-open source license. A proprietary software license is similar to an open source license in that they both apply to the software. However, proprietary software licenses generally have more restrictions on how the licensed software can be used. For example, it is common for proprietary software licenses to disallow sharing of the software with other users, or to disallow making any derivative versions. Proprietary licenses are usually vendor-specific, and therefore there are as many proprietary licenses as there are vendors selling proprietary software. There's nothing wrong with proprietary software licensing. It is simply a business decision taken by the authors of the software. However, it is important to be aware that this is a different approach to open source software licensing. There are various types of software licenses that may provide software without cost, but under terms different from an open source license. This highlights two things. Open source software is not a synonym for free of charge software, and vice versa. One common example is called freeware, a type of proprietary software that is free of charge. This is usually fully functional and available for use within constraints applied by the author. However, typically the source code is not made available. Freeware usually imposes restrictions in relation to copying, distributing, and making derivative works of the software, as well as restrictions on the type of usage, personal, commercial, academic, etc. The latter point is particularly important, as open source, by the OSI definition, cannot limit the field of use of the software. Another common example is public domain software. This refers to software not protected by copyright and therefore usable by the public without requiring a license. For example, statements such as, "All of the code and documentation in the software has been dedicated to the public domain by the authors." A public domain declaration like this attempts to waive or eliminate any and all intellectual property rights, and it may be accompanied by other terms like a warranty disclaimer. However, in some legal jurisdictions around the world, there are types of rights associated with authorship called moral rights that simply cannot be waived. The Creative Commons CC0 declaration of a broad license is designed to address this. In practice, however, public domain software is generally treated the same as open source software with an extremely permissive license.